This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 231 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So Mel Kiper published a mock draft this week, and in that mock draft, Terry McLaurin was a first-round pick. He went 26th overall to the Colts. And when I saw it, I did a double take. I had to actually make sure that I was looking at the right round of this mock draft. Now, Kiper might know something that I don't. So my thinking that this McLaurin pick was crazy isn't so much that I think that Kiper is crazy, but a team actually taking Terry McLaurin in the first round, that's crazy. They would be crazy to take him there. Now, I get the allure with a prospect like him. He ran a 4.35, he had a great Senior Bowl, he's a strong route runner, but this is why production-based scouting is important. You can spot red flags with players by strictly looking at production. Now, I say it all the time, but if we know that successful, productive wide receivers in the NFL were also successful and productive in college, then why would we ignore the college production side of things? We literally have more information that will help us be more accurate. We shouldn't ignore that. So if we don't ignore it, then we'd see that Terry McLaurin has some serious red flags. During his final season, which really was his only season with legitimate production, but during this final season, McLaurin finished with just 14% of Ohio State's receiving yards, only 8.9% of the team's receptions, and 22% of the team's touchdowns. Those are legitimately bad marks. If you look back at all first-round wide receivers since 2005, no player has market share numbers that low during their final collegiate season. So if McLaurin were to be drafted in the first round, he'd be arguably, and I'd almost say definitively, the least productive first-round wide receiver in recent history. And again, we know there's correlation between success at the NFL level and success at the college level from a production standpoint. I talked through all of this about a month ago on episode 222. It's very difficult to find wide receivers with market share numbers as bad as Terry McLaurin's, who then go on to have successful NFL careers. And to go along with that, McLaurin is entering the NFL at 23 years of age. He's old. We always have to give these numbers some context. I totally get it. McLaurin had serious competition at wide receiver at Ohio State. But that doesn't mean that we push these red flags away. That doesn't mean that his production is irrelevant. And this doesn't mean that McLaurin can't or won't be good at the NFL level. It just means that trends aren't in his favor. That probability doesn't favor Terry McLaurin. And that's what the NFL draft is. It's a game of probability. These teams are making educated guesses about which players will pan out at the next level. So if you're making an educated guess, wouldn't you want to make sure that your guess at least hits some minimum thresholds? Or that your educated guess came from a place where you didn't need an outlier to happen for the pick to hit? This is why Terry McLaurin in the first round is absolutely nuts, especially in a draft class that's filled with some really good wide receivers. It's irresponsible to just ignore production like that. Before we get into this week's mailbag questions, I wanted to let all of you know that FanDuel is celebrating the start of the NBA playoffs with the Fantasy Playoff by throwing a huge yacht party in Miami presented by Playboy. Keep up with all the NBA action, party with the playmates and celebrity guests, and watch a special performance by Flo Rida. Qualify now to earn your spot for the chance to join the celebration and compete for a share of $1 million in prizes by visiting FanDuel.com/fantasy. That's FanDuel.com/FANTASEA. This first question is an email. It says, JJ, need some help with rules for a keeper league. What are do's and don'ts? Also, what are some fun and different ways for keeper penalties? Thanks, Mark. There are lots of ways to do keepers, and they depend on whether or not you're dealing with a snake draft or an auction draft. With auction drafts, you should just be able to keep a player at the cost that they were drafted, but provide some sort of inflation year in and year out on that base price. That way they become more costly as the years go on. For a snake draft, I'm cool with leagues where you get to keep a player at the round that they were drafted. If you're worried about teams dominating the league because they get lucky with a few late round picks, then just put a cap on the number of years that you can keep that player. What I'm not that big of a fan of is making every keeper the same value. It just doesn't reward people for finding later round gems when they should be rewarded for that. So I hope that answer helps. This next question is from @full10yards. Jared Cook or Vance McDonald in redraft for 2019, #late round tight end. So I thought about this a good bit when this question was asked, and I think that my answer is actually Vance McDonald. The Steelers have had about 220 more pass attempts than the Saints have over the last 2 years. And they've actually thrown a higher percentage of their passes to the tight end position over this time. And with arguably less competition for targets than Cook will see in New Orleans, I think that Vance McDonald can see a pretty similar target share as Jared Cook next season. And if the target shares are similar, then volume will favor the tight end in the more pass-heavy offense. It may not be as efficient, but I think McDonald is the answer as of today. Now, I haven't built out my projections yet, so I can't say it definitively, but I think McDonald has at least a higher ceiling in 2019. This next question is from @BillsMafia80. Hey, late round QB, mailbag question beside the obvious, love the pod. Can you give me your top 5 criteria in any order for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end when it comes to evaluating rookies? So I do a lot less with tight ends and quarterback, but as a teaser, I'll be talking to Jim Sonis on next week's show about this year's quarterback class. So you'll get some information on the position on that show. And as you might have heard earlier this week from Anthony Amico, with tight ends, it's really just about raw production. Are they getting targets? But with running backs and wide receivers, I don't know if I have a top 5 per se, but I have things that I definitely look for. And of course, guys, I'm going to give you numbers-driven answers here. So let's start with wide receivers. I want a wide receiver who checks the boxes in the main market share categories. So reception share, receiving yard share, and touchdown share. That's important, and that's mostly for their final collegiate season. But I also like to see production for more than one season, so that's another thing to look for. Multiple seasons of strong production. And that plays into breakout age, which is very, very important. Like if there were 2 things to look at quickly in order to see if a wide receiver is a good prospect or not, it's college production and breakout age. And then you've got to look at things like height and weight to make sure that they've got a reasonable build. And then after that, I'll look to make sure they're decent enough athletes from a testing standpoint. Those would be the big bucket things. And a lot of them are the same at running back. You want volume at the position. You want rushing production, though volume is more important than rushing production. And then I like to see good reception share marks. It's good when a running back was a good receiver because it tells you that they were utilized in a lot of different ways in college. Because they're good. Good players are used in a lot of different ways. And speaking of that, it's also noteworthy when players are on special teams as well. And then at running back, the top thing I'm concerned with combine-wise is speed score. So weight-adjusted 40 time. I also want to be clear that I don't only scout by numbers. I use it as a baseline, then I watch each player to make sure that what I see matches what the numbers say. I just am more confident in what the numbers tell me because they've done a good job in spotting outliers and values in rookie drafts. And remember, guys, landing spot matters too. This next question is from @JakeAndersonFF. How do you substantiate potential and upside compared to floor when evaluating rookies? Thanks, JJ. By the way, we are naming our baby boy Jackson James, so we will be calling him JJ as well. First off, Jake, congrats on the baby boy. And you chose a very, very elite name. The thing I've learned over the last 8 months of my life is that there's truly nothing better than being a dad, though. So nothing but love to you and your family. To answer your question, I do think we often get potential and upside wrong all the time. So even though we categorize certain players that way, we're not always categorizing them correctly because we're wrong a lot. But I would say that it has to do with evidence. Like DK Metcalf is a great example here. Metcalf has this great ceiling, or he has a lot of potential at wide receiver because of the physical tools that he brings to the position. But the reason he's got a scary floor is because we don't have a very large sample of elite production. And then on top of that, if you don't think that someone like Metcalf can play all over the field, then there's even less room for error. Because if he's playing a lot on the outside and he's failing at that, he won't naturally be able to be moved to the slot. So that limits things. N'Keal Harry, though, is different. He's safe. He's got a safe floor because he produced throughout his college career, his breakout age is really strong, and then we can also project him more safely as someone who can play the slot. He can play everywhere. So to me, the easiest way to answer this is just by evidence. You just feel better about things when there's more evidence about that certain thing. Like if you're going bar hopping one night and you have to do something the next morning, chances are you're going to drink something that you know won't give you as bad of a hangover because you've had that drink before and it served you well. You're probably not going to try a bunch of different new beers when one of them might make you sick. Basically, Bud Light is N'Keal Harry. Some random craft beer that has a chance to taste like my dog's foot, that's DK Metcalf. This next question is from @JackBree94813581. How are you thinking about the Chargers' target share and resulting volume? The reason being, Mike Williams and Hunter Henry both getting pushed as buys with Tyrell Williams leaving, but doesn't appear to be enough volume for both unless running back share or Keenan Allen comes backwards. One thing to always keep in mind with questions like this is that players are going to also take volume from others who were in those positions last year. So it's not like we need to find 15% of the Chargers' targets for Hunter Henry in order for him to get a 15% target share. We only really need to find like 4.5% or so to take over Antonio Gates' role, because Gates saw 10.5% of the team's attempts last year. I guess to answer this question, I need to know what your expectation would be for players like Williams and Henry. If you're thinking they're going to be 20% target share guys, then I think that's a little bit optimistic. But I would say the running backs and Keenan Allen can hold their target shares if you're thinking about a 15% share for Williams and Henry. And I think that's very reasonable with a little bit of a buffer for them to see more. So I guess that you could say that I'm not in the camp of buying those players this offseason. I think they're fine, so I wouldn't be selling them, but I'm not going out of my way to get them given other pieces in that offense. This next question is from @FFTylerO. What's your opinion on tanking? Is it savvy management to put a team in position to succeed down the road, or are you ripping off loyal players/fans who back the organization with sweat equity and money? So I don't think teams should tank just to tank. You need some sort of plan and purpose. But do I think it's savvy management to acquire assets and maybe understand that it'll be a year or two before your team is competitive? If there's a reason for it, then sure. I don't think you should be in purgatory as a team just to satisfy your fans. Like, look at the Giants right now. They don't think they have to rebuild, or they say they're going to try and be competitive while they build, but you don't think the fans are turned off anyway? So if your concern is how fans are going to react, and if you're the Giants, you might as well just blow up that team and start from scratch. I'm also a believer that people tend to overstate the duration of a tank and a rebuild in the NFL. It doesn't have to take a ton of time, and we're seeing that right now with the Browns. But those are really just my high-level thoughts on tanking. It's really, really easy to go down a long rant about tanking in general, but I'll save that for another day. This last question is from @Jamie Whiteman. It says, how do you recommend someone who aspires to work in the fantasy industry to get started? Writing, social media, analytics, asking for a friend. I get messages and emails about this all the time, and if any of you guys have those questions, you're more than welcome to hit me up. But the answer is to honestly just put together compelling content. If you do good content in the fantasy industry, people will embrace it. It's a competitive landscape in that a lot of people are trying to publish content, but it's not competitive at all in that everyone wants everyone else to succeed. If you produce content that's refreshing and differentiated, others in the industry will help promote that content and get you to a spot where you can showcase your talent. And speaking to that differentiation point, that's also very key. I've gotten so many writing samples during my time at Numberfire, and I can't tell you how many times people have sent me generic rankings article and stuff that you can get just anywhere. It's really important to create content that's different, but different in a way that still provides utility. But I promise you, if the content is good, people will come. You've got to obviously push it and join the conversation on social media, Twitter specifically, but this isn't an industry that rejects people. It's one that embraces new ideas. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. You can follow me on there for more data-driven analysis and bad dad jokes. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.